And welcome back to Travel Market Life. In today's episode, we are looking at HR Law Changes 2025. We'll be exploring new HR law, employee benefits, travel policies, and the impact that will have on the travel and hospitality industry. With our guest, Ami Naru, the partner at Trav Law.
Welcome to Travel Market Life, your companion for industry insights and professional business development. Travel Market Life. Join us by webcast, video or podcast.
So guys, welcome back. A big, huge topic now. People. This is a thing for you, Claire. It's your guest. So, what does the horizon look like for HR, for travel and hospitality businesses?
I think it's fair to say a lot of challenges lie ahead. Some are good, some maybe not so good for business. Ami and I work very closely together anyway, and I know she's, one is an expert on all of these things, will have a lot to say. For me, I think that our industry has a huge amount of small employers that don't have an HR function and maybe aren't aware or are afraid of what this means for them. And I think so I'm lifting the lid on what they need to do is really key. And some of the bigger businesses actually may still not be as aware as they should be over some of these changes. Some of them, I think, maybe have gone under the radar, and I know Ami will be covering those.
Just generally, though, to you, Claire, I mean, how do you feel about working in the profession of HR today? Is it a desirable sector to be working in?
Okay, so I've been doing HR for over 30 years now, which really ages me. And increasingly, you have to become more of a legal expert. There's no doubt about it. I think, dare I say it, AI is actually helping in a little bit in that. But again, you need to be very cautious with that. There are a lot of challenges. You have to keep abreast of it. And I think with the new Employment Rights Bill, which I know we're going to be discussing, it is a fundamental change that we haven't seen for many years. And so businesses and HR professionals need to really be on top of it. So it's a challenging time. I'm glad I'm coming to the end of my career now. But HR is still a great place to be in because you're dealing with people and you never know what's going to happen.
Well, I'm glad that we're addressing this topic then, because obviously we're addressing it head on, helping people, helping businesses identify some of the things that are coming up. Now, running businesses, you guys, when you're looking at HR, sort of what first pops in your mind, Will?
Hi, everyone. What pops in my mind? Absolute fear and dread. Being entirely honest, HR scares me. We're lucky enough to be in the travel industry, which is all about people. It's all about personality. I love the people that work for me, but, certainly caring for a small business, they don't care about the business like you care about your own business. You have all the challenges around it. And I'm hoping to learn a lot today because it's one of the things, and we employ people externally to take our HR, but every sort of loophole, pitfall, everything else, it scares the life out of me. Yes, I'll talk to you later, Claire. Don't worry.
What I always found interesting, particularly, is that, there is this Labour's coming back into government. They're going to have a lot of new laws and that for people. But actually, the previous government brought a lot of changes in as well. So it doesn't seem to matter sort of what government it is.
Yeah, this isn't a political thing at all. This isn't a government thing. This is a responsibility as an employer. These are laws. They are constantly changing and you need to be abreast of them. You need to know what's going on. And also there's a lot of sort of hearsay about a lot of things. There's a lot of news articles about this is coming or this is the expectation or, your workers can all work from home and it's better for their health. No, it's worse for their health. You've got to stick to the law. And I think too often we get caught up in a lot of the rhetoric and the stories out there. I personally find it a bit of a minefield. So I really am looking forward to learning today. I might even stay quiet, but we'll see.
James Clark, Travel Zoo. So looking after a lot of people here in the UK, you work with your counterparts abroad, you get to sort of see some of the differences and the challenges that they're dealing with. What are some of the questions that are or things within HR that you're sort of addressing at the moment within the business?
So hi everyone, lovely to be here again. I think there's a few things. First off, it is a bit of a minefield, as Will said, for both the employer and the employee. I think employees aren't kept up to date with the changes and their rights. And at the same time, employees get drips and drabs of information. So we're very fortunate. We have a central HR team and we have a central legal team that supports them on all the changes, not just in the UK, but across Europe and the US and North America. And there are nuances across them all. There are things that are very similar. There's things that are so different, especially when you look at somewhere like France and Spain, the employment laws are very, very different. And I think it's having the right information so you can provide the clearest response to an employee at the right time. And I think that's really, really part and parcel. But to everybody's point, so much has changed in the past year or 2 years. So much is planning to change. And I think we all just need to be kept very much, as we've all said, abreast of it.
And do you find that employees are much more aware of their rights? Or is there a bit of confusion as to what they believe their rights are?
I'll make you laugh, because yesterday I saw an expense go through for some glasses and an eye test, and I didn't even know we had a policy that did that. So you just never know. You really don't. And I look after all the people, and I had to check that with HR. I said, do we pay up to £150 for glasses? So HR was going to listen to this. They're going to go do this now. I didn't even know that. I didn't even know that.
But I think that's a good point in terms of what we're lacking. And okay, we can go out and find it, but it's that information two ways, and probably being equipped as an employer, equipping the employees and having that sort of clarity around it.
And also, employees generally will focus on the benefits of HR, where the employer looks at more the constraints and how HR supports them running it. So they are looking at it from two different vectors.
Ooh, there's a can of worms are being opened here, and I see that Ami Naru, the partner at Travelor, is desperate to jump in here and help us. She is partner and head of employment at Travelor, specialising in the travel and hospitality industry, advising on all aspects of employment law, both contentious and non-contentious, to a range of corporate clients. So welcome here. I'm pleased that you could join us today. And there's a lot happening.
Oh, there's so much happening. First of all, it'll be 25 years this year since I qualified as an employment lawyer. There has never been so much employment legislation than there is now. There are probably about 70 odd pieces of employment legislation around at this moment in time. Compared to when I first started, there were maybe 4 or 5. So there's a lot of law around, okay, coupled with employees have got access to the internet, to ChatGPT, to whatever, and so they know what their rights are. So you've got a very educated, modern workforce, okay? So that causes a blessing, but it's also a problem, because companies, whether you're big or whether you are small, need to get your house in order. And going back to that point, is this a political issue, an agenda? Some of it is. So if we take day one unfair dismissal rights, which we'll come on to talk about in a minute, they've been around for 50 years. At their lowest, they've been 6 months to qualify before you can claim unfair dismissal. Under a Labour government, at their highest, they've been 2 years under a Tory government. Now, depending whether it's Labour or Tories who are in power, they tend to go up under a Tory government and they tend to come down under a Labour government. And a lot of the legislation you will see will either be employer friendly or employee friendly, depending on who's in power. So I would say that there is a bit of a political influence. We knew that. Labour set out their stall very early, and they are promising that they are going to deliver on what they said that they would in the manifesto.
So April's here, 2025. What's rolling forward? What are the key things that employers in this space need to be conscious of?
Okay, so pretty much every April and sometimes in October, legislative changes are implemented. There was a lot of fanfare, a lot of press headlines after Labour came into government, and employers were hit with the triple whammy. So in April, there's an increase to national minimum wage. It's going to go up to £12.21, which is quite a significant increase of about 6.7%. There is also the increase to employers' national insurance contributions. So that was the second whammy. And the third one is the legislative changes, which they've described as a generational change in employment law, which isn't coming into force in April. That's coming in later down the line, and that's the big misconception that it's already law. So what has to happen in that respect is everything that was mentioned in the Employment Rights Bill, which I think amounts to 28 proposals, they have to go out to consultation. So, the unions will say their 2 pence worth, employer type organisations, and any employers as well who want to contribute to those consultations can do. Then it has to go through both houses of Parliament. Then it has to receive royal assent. And we've already been told in respect to the day one unfair dismissal rights, they won't come into force any sooner than autumn of 2026. Now, that's not to say that employers should just sit back and wait for the law to come in. I think employers need to be on the front foot. First of all, they need to keep abreast of what these changes are and when they're coming in. And secondly, why wait for the government to dictate to you what you have to comply with? Show to your employers that you're forward thinking and that you're ahead of the curve. So simply with regards to day one unfair dismissal rights, what does that actually mean? It means that you're going to have, instead of 2 years to assess whether employment is suitable and the employee is suitable for your organisation, you can have a much smaller window, which the government are calling the initial period of employment, which is what you and I know as the probationary period. Okay. There is a bit of conflict within the Labour government as to what that initial period of employment should be. I think the Deputy Prime Minister wants it to be a maximum of 3 months, and the Business Secretary wants it to be a maximum of 9 months. If I was a betting girl, which I'm not, I would say around about 6 months is probably comfortable, and that's in line with what I recommend most employers to adopt now anyway. 3 months is just a bit too short, particularly if you've got hybrid working, remote workers. They're not in the office, so you can't constantly monitor them as closely as you would, as if we were all working back in the office. The next thing is, it means you can't just wait until the last week of that probationary period and say, we're keeping this person on or not. You've got to be proactive. That means you've got to have robust reviews and during the probationary period, and your managers need to know what they are looking for during those probationary periods.
I would say one thing I find time and time again, particularly in smaller businesses, is people don't understand today's probationary issues, which is if you have a 3-month probationary period and you suddenly go at 3 months and 1 day, oops, we don't actually want you to continue, but it's too late, right? They have automatically become members of staff. And I think people need to understand that. So what you were saying about having a robust probation review policy is really, really key.
Yes, that's absolutely right. However, if a client phones me at this moment in time and says, we want to get rid of somebody just outside their probationary period, the first thing I will say is, have they been there 2 years or not? Because if they haven't been there 2 years, it's much easier. And as brutal as it may sound, to terminate someone's employment, the only way that they can normally bring a claim is if they've got a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. So they're disabled, or because of their race or their sex, or it's for an automatically unfair reason, such as they've blown the whistle. So it is very much still easier to terminate someone's employment within the first 2 years. Post these changes, it's going to be much harder. So you have to work very actively in ensuring that that new individual is a right fit for your organisation. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with them.
Sounds to me as well, that's almost like another nail in the coffin from remote working. Because if you want to know how someone's performing, you want to see their productivity, you want to see how they're interacting with people across the team, you need to, certainly from my experience when I was working within an enterprise, get feedback from other members over how that person's performing. The only real way you can do that is if they've got direct experience, not just through email or through video calls. So, are we starting to see, obviously there's been a lot of headlines about sort of moving back to the office, but is that also a real sort of HR concern and necessity for meeting these guidelines?
Yeah, I think that was one of the issues that was flagged up right at the outset during the pandemic about remote working, about onboarding staff, about reviewing them. Is you can't just do what you did before. You have to do things differently to be able to monitor and review their performance. And a lot of employers just thought, oh, it's fine, they'll just sit at home or just carry on doing what we've always done. So if you haven't already, you need to change your ways in terms of that review. But going to the point about working from home, I always said this, collecting about this during the very many webinars that we did during the pandemic, that there would always be a shift back to the office. It was very trendy, it was very fashionable, but people's attitudes have changed. They've tasted it, they've experienced it, they miss that interaction of face-to-face dealings with people. And also, I think I read a statistic somewhere that you're more likely to get promoted.
100%.
I'm interested to know what the expectations and the laws around that are, because you hear stories both ways. You know, working from home is good for your health. Now it's not. You know, people still have expectations around, you know, oh, well, I've got this to do or that to do. Can I? But I'm interested to know, firstly, what the law is, but also when you're employing people and also existing employees, what that looks like and what we should be doing and expecting of our staff, really.
Yeah, so a lot of lifestyles changed, didn't they, during the pandemic, which resulted in more people wanted to work from home. People reevaluated what they were doing. At this moment in time, there is no automatic right to be able to work flexibly, okay? The law did change in October of 24, but what that change was, it was basically saying that you didn't have to have 26 weeks service before you could make an application for flexible working. It became a day one right. And secondly, it was basically saying that you could make more than one application per year. So that's the first thing. Yes, you've got a right to request. You don't have a right to work. Okay. With regard to existing employees, again, contract will say what the place of work is. If by habit they have been working from home for the last 2 or 3 years, it may become an implied term, that even though it's not written down, that's what's been happening in practice. So there's no automatic right. Employers can still rely on the 8 statutory reasons to reject an application. However, there was a lot of fanfare about Labour proposing it to be the default position, or there was going to be a 4-day working week. None of that's happened. What Labour have proposed as part of the Employment Rights Bill is that it will be harder for employers to knock back requests under one of the 8 prescribed statutory reasons, because they're going to have to demonstrate that that rejection is reasonable. And ultimately, that may mean that who determines whether that's reasonable or not could be an employment tribunal, which may mean there's another raft or avenue of employment tribunal claims. I think, I mean, not to sound too doom and gloom about it, but the number of employment tribunals is going to rise, not only on the back of flexible working being reasonable or not, but also because a whole raft of employees are going to have day one rights to unfair dismissal, whereas previously they would have had to work there for 2 years.
Well, that's something to look forward to, isn't it?
Well, the other thing that I should point out is there are no tribunal fees, and normally the employee can be a litigated person and represent themselves, which is really a nightmare for employers because they don't understand the law and they go full throttle at it. So it's hard to manage the cases. And just quickly, each party bears their own costs in an employment tribunal. So it's not like some of the courts where if you lose, you end up paying the other side's costs. So there's not a lot for employees to lose by basically venturing down that line.
And I think that there are 2 points I'd make here. And you and I have had long discussions about this. One is I think there will be a rise in settlement agreements as a result of this. The other thing, and I think that's a risk as well, because again, we talked about employees being aware and hearing things. So it might set precedents and businesses need to be aware of that. But I want to pick up on this reasonableness, because again, I think a lot of people get confused over what that looks like. So what's reasonable for a company with 3,000 employees in terms of flexible working, where they've got more room to move, maneuver and change things, is not is potentially unreasonable for a small employer. And actually, there isn't necessarily one size fits all for a small employer. So they may allow one person in their business to work a certain flexible agreement, but that doesn't automatically mean that other people can do the same, even though they've already allowed it for someone else, because it might not be reasonable for them as employers or for that role itself to be that. And I think that's an area that we need to sort of be clear on.
Well, one of the other areas I think is going to see a massive change is the recruitment process, because HR, individuals or teams, the focus is going to go on to them in how they recruit the individuals that are going through the process. Because they're going to say, we don't want to be in a scenario where we need to let go people. We need to sharpen up the recruitment process. In fact, we need to put people through more tests, more this, and create more layers. So to get a job will be more difficult. I think that's what's going to happen, because they're going to look at the repercussions if that process goes wrong.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with that. That, onboarding someone and working out whether it works or not is really the last step in terms of, are they going to be a long-term member of staff? There's a whole piece of work during the recruitment process that needs to be done. And even to this day, a lot of employers don't do a lot of the due diligence that they should be doing. It's not just about references. Do a bit of stalking on social media. You're perfectly entitled to do it. See if their LinkedIn profile marries up with their CV. See, if there's gaps that don't make sense. We're a very close-knit industry. If you know someone who's working at their ex-employer, pick up the phone and say, what's the crack?
Yeah. And the travel industry is pretty good at doing that as a kind of a niche, because everyone knows everyone.
So small. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
I think that's true from a certain level, but I think for new starters, this is where it's going to be quite critical. So not just young people coming in out of university or school, but actually people coming in from other industries. And we are seeing an increasing number of that, which and really successfully coming in from outside industries. And we all know as business people, it's quite, much as we love our industry and the people within it, we actually bringing in fresh ideas can be really good and really healthy for us.
And one of the things that you mentioned that has sort of quietly come in because of the furore of everything else that's been going on is the sexual harassment, isn't it? Tell us a bit about that, because what I'd like to move on to is obviously the impact of culture within business. But I think this is a particularly important point we need to look at.
It's really important, and it also fits very well within the culture of an organisation. So there's been a lot of campaigns in the press and so on over the last 5 or 6 years, Me Too, #MeToo and so on. Whether we like to accept it or not, sexual harassment still does occur in the workplace. I'm not just talking about the travel industry, I'm talking about the workplace as a whole, okay? And this wasn't something that the Labour government had quickly rushed through. This was on the tables, regardless of which government was going to come in. So on the 26th of October last year, 2024, there is now a new mandatory duty on all employers, irrelevant of your size. So even if you've got 2 employees or 2,000, that you have to take proactive steps to eliminate, reduce, or minimise sexual harassment in the workplace. If you don't, and an employee brings a claim, the tribunal have the power to uplift those damages by a further 25%. Okay. So if that's not scary enough, I think the other thing to focus on is these are the sorts of cases that the press really like. That, the Friday before the next week's listings in tribunal, they'll be looking at the list to see which are the juicy ones that are going to create headlines, and then they go and sit in those rooms and report on them. No employer in this industry wants to appear as a headline in local press or the travel press that they've got an ongoing sexual harassment claim. So there's reputational damage, but then that has a knock-on impact in terms of your own culture, and employees are like, do we want to really be working in an environment where this happens, or it's condoned, or our employees do nothing about it? And it also probably will have a subsequent impact on your ability to recruit if you've hit the headlines for the wrong reasons. So it's not just about the law telling you what to do, it's about being proactive.
And I think a good example of that is a very well-known fast food burger chain who have been put across the BBC and newspapers for not handling it.
And if you don't handle it, it's quite costly in terms of financial and reputation. So you're probably thinking, what do we as employers have to do? Okay. It's reasonable steps at this moment in time. When the Employment Rights Bill comes into force, probably next year, it will be all reasonable steps. So they added that small word of all in, but it's really powerful word. So There is no prescribed list that you can do a tick box. Again, the Equality and Human Rights Commission have put guidance on their website. As a starting point, you definitely need a policy in place. There's no point having a policy if it's going to be stuck in a staff handbook and nobody's ever going to read it. You need to roll out training to your staff. And whenever I propose this, they're like, you're just doing a killjoy. Basically, we can't go anywhere and we can't have fun and we can't have a drink. But no, well, we're not saying that. What we're saying is just be sensible, okay? What you think is funny, somebody else might not think is funny and they might be offended by it.
And this is where we do come into culture and, obviously absolutely not endorsing sort of negative or bullying or any sort of behavior, but every industry, every type of business has been renowned for its culture of some kind. You've wanted to invoke a certain sense or feeling of sentiment amongst your staff. You've wanted to also convey that through the brand and the way you engage with your customers. And there is this sort of neutralization that we've seen over the last few years as people get fearful over sort of, what does that mean if someone misbehaves inappropriately? And, as a single man, I decided to, want to find out, how do you meet someone? And I did a bit of look at, how people met one another. And up until about 5 to 7 years ago, for a good 40, 50 years, over 2/3 of people met their partners at work. And it seems that has massively obviously had to pull back because of this worries around sexual harassment, but also this drinking culture, going and having drinks after work, having their Christmas parties, just having, any form of social occasion. What's sort of like guidance and recommendations there? How do you try to create productive working relationships that also allows that sense of fun and enjoyment in the workplace?
But it's not aimed to kill the fun out. It's basically aiming to make sure that you use your common sense, you're respectful, you back off, basically, when someone said no. So take your example. Are people going to meet their future partners at work in years to come? Yes, they probably will. However, if you've made a request for a date, let's say, for example, and somebody said no, you've got to respect that decision. You can't keep harassing them. And you can't, if you're managing that individual, for example, you can't say, well, you're not having a pay rise because you rejected my request for a drink. And that's where the common sense comes into it. That there's, years gone by, 20, 30 years ago, there was a very distinct imbalance in power. The employer held the upper hand, basically. And, you used to go to work and if your employer said jump, you'd be like, well, hi. That's changed now. And I think it's just changing as the generations change, in this modern working world that we work in.
I mean, the thing is that, we've always regarded sometimes public service jobs, civil servant jobs have always been pretty laid back, easygoing. But, if you're working for a startup or an enterprise, then, you are working the grind, you were doing 12-hour days and, okay, I get some of it. You are being perhaps pushed to an edge, but some people, that's how they thrive. That's what they thrive under. And when it becomes a little bit more nicey nice, they lack to thrive. Their productivity goes down. Their positivity towards that role. So there has to be, clearly, there must be some sort of recognition that not everyone is the same. Everybody has different motivational touch points. And we need to be able to create an environment where, regulation and law doesn't prevent someone from excelling because you're unable to create that environment for them.
And there's the key point, everybody is different. So with sexual harassment, it's not what I intended, it's how it's been received. So, Claire might not find something offensive, but you might find it offensive. And because we are so diverse in our makeup and our backgrounds and so on and so forth, you just have to be respectful. And, it's very simple. It's about using common sense and not stepping over that line.
I wasn't just talking about sexual harassment. I was talking about bullying at work, perspective of what is bullying and what isn't bullying, you see, or being overworked.
So I think there's 2 points there. First off, we are all social creatures. So the social environment, we're talking about work from home and being in an office. And being in the office, everyone's social, whether if it's gathering around the coffee machine in the morning and asking what you did at the weekend, to wanting to say who fancies a drink after work on a Thursday, to down to the pub, so on. So there's that element. And you want that as an employer, you want people to be social because productivity is there where they trust their colleagues and work with their colleagues. The boundaries that you set is an important part. And I think the other thing that we have to realize is we also now work in businesses where so many people come from very different walks of life or different cultures. You could have someone who comes from Europe and are culturally different in Europe to the way you greet people, to the way you spend time with people, the way you might put your arm around someone and say, hey, well, that's what we do in Spain or that's what we do in France. It's different how we are in each market. And I think that's why those boundaries are so clear from the offset, to ensure that, look, this is how we want to work. We want to work in a safe environment and a productive environment, but also be aware of your colleagues. And like you said, know where those boundaries are.
I'm interested how you approach it, James. For me, I find it all quite stifling in terms of, as an employer, it's almost safer to do nothing or to limit what you do and to restrict things, because then we're not going to fall foul of any law. I can't get into trouble. There's not going to be issues around that, being completely honest. So you go, play it safe, which is a great shame. But I'd probably say increasingly, and as the staffing gets bigger, it's, there's so many dangers, there's so many pitfalls. That's how I approach it. It's just like safety first, which is a great shame, but I think it's hard.
I understand that. I think you're missing a mark there, though, because as James says, we are social creatures. Our industry is an incredibly social one. You're quite right. People from different backgrounds, people from different cultures. So some don't drink, some have different approaches to friendliness and everything else. But it's about them understanding the rules and the boundaries that you set. It's about your duty of care as an employer. And I think the other thing, and I'm sure Ami can expand on this, is we talked about your staff understanding and your and your duty of care to them. But that goes further down. So if you're sending them to an event, right, it might not be your team that's that's doing the harassing. They might be harassed by a supplier. So it's that sort of thing. So it's really making sure that your staff feel protected by you. And that they know that they have cause. And if you respond quickly and they see that you've got their back, that actually is positive for your culture.
That's really a good segue to say that there's another thing that the Employment Rights Bill is going to extend, is that duty to prevent sexual harassment will apply to third parties that your employees come into contact with. So that takes it to another level. And they will similarly want to ensure that you put provisions into place to make sure that when your staff go onto their premises or deal with their employees, that risk has been reduced as far as possible. So let's just take an example. You send a member of staff off to a supplier, an incident occurs. It's not just the incident that we've got to worry about, it's the bigger commercial relationship we've got to worry about as well. So, yes, we are a social industry. Yes, we should continue to socialise because it's really important for bonding, for morale and all of those things. The likelihood and the probability of sexual harassment occurring is probably quite small. And all we're trying to do is to make that probability from quite small to virtually zero because we've put into place steps.
I guess it's a bit like the slavery clause. If you're working with a partner, for as long as you both sign up to the fact that you've got that modern slavery clause, then in the same way you have a modern sexual offences or whatever clause, then at least you're both talking on the same hymn sheet.
Absolutely. And I think it's personally going to go further than that. I think in commercial contracts, there will now start to appear a clause where it's we warrant or you warrant that you have taken all reasonable steps to prevent your sexual harassment in the workplace, blah, blah, blah. And there'll be indemnities and warranties being requested in those types of documents. So I think it'll go further than that.
But to Claire's point, I probably am missing the mark, but can you not see, as a small business owner, and I'm sure I'm not alone, we're all fearful of what might happen, and we putting so much energy into our businesses to make them successful. We want the positive. We want to avoid all negatives at every cost. And I'm the first to admit our culture currently is probably not right and is probably suffering as a result because we probably are too restrictive.
Work in insurance work, I'd say you have mitigating risk right at the end of the day. But also, again, it's about knowing your staff. And I mean, there was an interesting thing, and it was a national. So again, it wasn't the travel industry. And I'd love to know the figures for the travel industry. But they asked teams of people if they still wanted Christmas parties, and over 70% of the people said no. we don't want a Christmas party. They'd rather spend the money on a nice Christmas gift or a Christmas boat or something like that. And I think that's just because of the changing society we live in today. It's not to say they don't socialise, but I think the Christmas party has got a bit of a reputation for lots of alcohol and that sort of thing, which isn't necessarily what
Get the photocopy machine out.
Zeal wants. Yeah, exactly. Well,
I'm in controllable risk, Claire. I'm in money and data. If you can get me all the data on my employees and I can put it into my tech and get all the various flashpoints and everything else, then I can mitigate against that. But people are the biggest uncertainties in the world.
So this sped through. There's so much that we covered off there, and it is a very intense topic, but incredibly important for all of us to be aware of. So, Ami, thank you ever so much for sharing those points. Is there any 1, 2, 3 tips that you would give to a small business to make sure they keep on top of HR changes?
Yeah, keep an eye out for legislative changes. Don't wait for the changes to come in. Be ahead of the curve. And there are things that you can do to make these changes, implement them, and come out winning in terms of engagement with your staff.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. I think we certainly got some final points there just now from the three amigos, James, Will and Claire. Thanks ever so much for your contributions. And hopefully that's given you something to think about in your own business and ways that you can approach this with your team, across the culture, and make sure that you have a nice, supportive working environment. You've been listening to Travel Market Life. Please check out more of our episodes and on the podcast channels, Spotify, Apple, or anywhere else that you listen to your podcasts. I'm your host, Ryan Haynes. Thanks for listening.
For more, go to Travel Market Life. The music Sensation by Zach Nelson is reproduced under license from Storyblocks. Travel Market Life is a Haynes Marcoms digital marketing agency production, serving the travel and technology industries.